They came with thunder in their engines and arrogance in their voice. The ships appeared above Earth without warning, sleek, silver constructs that defied gravity and dwarfed human imagination. Their arrival wasn't marked by destruction, but by silence. A silence filled with contempt. Then the broadcast came. It was delivered across every satellite, hijacking every screen, every frequency, in every language. Your resistance is illogical. Your weapons are primitive. Surrender now, and minimal damage will be permitted. They called themselves the Sovereignty, a collective of civilizations thousands of years older than humanity. They claimed to bring peace through order, unity through control. To them, Earth was just another wild outpost to domesticate. They saw our history, chaos and conflict, and laughed. They reviewed our archives, watched our war footage, and dismissed it all as spectacle. They mocked our missiles, comparing them to sparklers. They called our aircraft carriers floating relics, our tanks obsolete metal beasts. They named our nuclear arsenal a desperation tool used by frightened apes. They misunderstood everything. They waited for surrender. But no reply came. For 3 days, their ships remained in low orbit, blotting out the stars over the cities they hovered above. Paris, Johannesburg, Delhi, Los Angeles, Tokyo, Moscow. There were no attacks. No signs of hostility. Just presence. A quiet kind of domination. They thought fear would work. They thought the silence meant submission. But the silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. What they never understood, what they couldn't understand, was that Earth never stopped preparing for war. War was part of our bloodline, woven into the DNA of every tribe, every nation, every soldier who'd ever stood and said, "No more." The Sovereignty thought strength came from refinement, elegant technology, polished systems, predictable results. But Earth's strength had never come from clean energy or efficient algorithms. It came from defiance. From stubbornness. From the unshakable will to survive when every logical metric said it shouldn't. They were used to civilization surrendering. Earth didn't. When the retaliation began, it didn't look like retaliation at all. It looked like chaos. Old silos, hidden deep in Earth's crust since the Cold War, came to life. Satellites, once dormant, suddenly began transmitting strange signals. Communications blacked out. Global systems glitched. And then the skies ignited. At 4:12 Universal Time Coordinated, 36 intercontinental ballistic missiles launched in synchronized silence. Not from one nation, but from many, an act not of alliance, but of agreement. These missiles weren't the cutting-edge technology of some secret space program. They were decades old. They were slow. They were crude. And they were never meant to pierce alien shielding. They weren't aimed at the ships. They were aimed below them. The explosions blanketed the upper atmosphere with waves of radiation, electromagnetic pulses, and turbulent heat. The Sovereignty's ships staggered. Several lost control as their stabilizers failed. EMPs rendered guidance systems useless. Heat signatures scrambled. Their elegant war engines became blind, drifting giants. One ship, too low and too slow to respond, dropped into the Pacific Ocean like a wounded leviathan. Another, its internal systems fried, attempted to land but burst into flame before touching the ground. A third was struck midair by a heat-seeking missile launched from an old submarine lurking off the coast of Alaska, an obsolete weapon the Sovereignty never thought to counter. They had never encountered enemies who fought dirty. They had never faced a civilization whose most powerful weapon was its unpredictability. And then came the jets. F-16s. Sukhoi. Raptors. Mirages. Old birds with teeth sharpened by generations of warfare. They weren't stealthy. They weren't smart. But they flew in waves, armed with dumb fire missiles and brute force tactics. They didn't need to pierce alien armor. They just needed to distract, to swarm, to disorient. And they did. The Sovereignty's countermeasures kicked in too late. Their targeting systems couldn't track the erratic flight patterns. Their defense turrets locked onto mirrored flares and ghost signals. The skies became a battlefield of miscalculation, What they expected to be an easy occupation was quickly turning into a storm of desperation. By the end of that day, half their fleet had fallen. Not to advanced countermeasures or planetary-level weaponry, but to timing. To old missiles. To soldiers who refused to go down quietly. The sovereignty had arrived expecting to teach a lesson. Instead, they were learning one. They had studied Earth's weapons. But they had never studied its people. Not really. They had never studied what desperation does to a species that has spent its entire history fighting itself just to survive. They didn't understand that humans are most dangerous not when they are confident, but when they are cornered. And this was just the beginning. The sovereignty's mistake wasn't arrogance, it was repetition. They believed Earth would react like every other world before it, a few loud protests, some pitiful resistance, and then silence. They'd seen it before. They expected it again. But Earth was not like the others. When the sky turned red, it wasn't the color of surrender. It was a warning. The second wave began not with sound, but with shadow. Massive carriers drifted across the stratosphere, blocking the sun with unnatural precision. Their purpose was clear: final intimidation. This time, their weapons were armed. The sovereignty no longer waited for Earth to kneel, they came to force it down. On their command decks, alien commanders analyzed telemetry, coordinated fleet formations, and reviewed Earth's military capacity with expressions that teetered between amusement and annoyance. They spoke in sharp syllables, confident that logic would prevail, and that this nuisance of a planet would finally submit. But Earth doesn't play by logic. As the carriers aligned, human defenses, what the sovereignty had labeled non-viable military systems, began moving. It wasn't coordinated. There was no global broadcast, no central leader issuing orders. It simply happened. One by one, humanity's defenses awoke, like an old beast that hadn't forgotten how to bare its teeth. An alien warship fired first. A pulse beam, blinding white, carved through the clouds over the American Midwest, vaporizing farmland and forest in a 10-kilometer radius. It was meant to cripple. Instead, it enraged. Before the blast could fully fade, a torpedo tore from the depths of the Atlantic and slammed into the warship's belly. An aging American submarine, silent beneath the ocean's skin, had struck back with nothing more than heat-tracking hardware and patience. The warship exploded in the sky, raining debris over the water it had never expected to fear. Across the globe, jets scrambled. They weren't the newest or the fastest. They weren't powered by fusion or driven by AI. They ran on fuel, instinct, and experience. They climbed into the heavens on wings built for war, not ceremony. Pilots didn't wait for permission. They knew what they were fighting for. These were not men and women with dreams of conquest. They were guardians of the line, the invisible line that said, no further. They attacked not to destroy, but to disrupt. To overwhelm the perfect systems of the sovereignty with chaos. Hundreds of missiles, guided, unguided, smart, dumb, ancient, modified, launched in irregular patterns, defying the cold math of alien battle strategy. The enemy's defense systems, built to intercept clean trajectories, failed to react. Their sensors were designed for precision. Humanity gave them disorder. In one sector, 6 jets flew toward a cruiser and all were destroyed. But 2 of them weren't carrying bombs. They were carrying electronic countermeasures, decades-old tech that scrambled radar and sent feedback loops into targeting arrays. The sovereignty didn't understand why the next wave of Earth's missiles hit so effectively. They never realized they'd already been blinded. One alien commander, aboard a vessel hovering over the Pacific, gave the order to retreat into high orbit. His name would never be known to humans, and his retreat wouldn't be recorded in any alien ledger. But the memory would pass silently across the fleet like a virus. Earth was not to be taken lightly. Even as debris rained into the oceans and cities prepared for the worst, the world below didn't fracture. Governments didn't collapse. The population didn't panic. Fear was replaced by focus. Across continents, humans began digging, building, repurposing. Civilians became engineers overnight. Mechanics learned alien metal. Old engineers whispered to young ones how to improvise when tools didn't exist. The world became a forge. And still, the sovereignty tried to rationalize. They believed Earth's victories were flukes. That their ships were unlucky. That humans were desperate, and desperation was temporary. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was far worse. Earth was not desperate. Earth was calm. Measured. It wasn't lashing out, it was planning. What the sovereignty could never understand, what no database could explain, was that humanity didn't win because of superior weapons or superior numbers. Humanity won because when everything breaks, when the lights go out and the world shakes, there is a single thought passed down through generations like sacred code: hold the line. And when the line breaks, become the wall. The sovereignty hadn't lost the war. Not yet. But they had lost something far more important. Certainty. And now, with their fleet burning in Earth's sky, certainty would never return. They came expecting war, but they didn't understand what kind. To the sovereignty, war was protocol. Measured. Clinical. A sequence of pre-approved tactics and responses. Controlled destruction. Calibrated force. Every strike judged by efficiency. Every move designed by consensus. That was how civilized species fought, by rules, by numbers, by the illusion of mastery. But Earth had never subscribed to those rules. Our wars had been ugly. Brutal. Unforgivable. And from them, we learned something far more valuable than precision: we learned how to adapt. The sovereignty's strategy relied on assumption. They assumed superiority. They assumed psychological domination. They assumed we'd crack under pressure. But assumption is a fragile weapon. And Earth had a habit of breaking things. When their ships faltered, they retreated, not out of fear, but out of confusion. The second wave had not gone as planned. They paused to reassess. In that pause, humanity moved. Not as one, not under a single banner or unified voice. That's not how Earth works. It moved in pieces, messy, disjointed, unpredictable pieces. But it moved with purpose. Special operations units began to converge on the wreckage of fallen ships. They didn't ask permission. They didn't wait for orders. They just moved. These weren't elite soldiers from some sci-fi fantasy. They were trained men and women, carrying decades of inherited doctrine and field-tested instinct. They didn't wear exocets. They wore worn boots. Their weapons weren't rail guns. They were rifles with scratched metal and familiar weight. And what they lacked in alien firepower, they made up for in something older: resolve. Inside the ruined hulls, they found technology far beyond anything Earth had built. But they didn't gawk. They tore it apart. They learned its bones. Oxygen recycling systems became mobile filtration units. Power cores were rigged into makeshift EMP mines. A crashed sovereign ship outside Berlin was reverse-engineered into a data relay within 48 hours. By the end of the week, multiple nations were already experimenting with propulsion systems still warm from the crash. What the sovereignty thought would terrify us, we turned into tools. Earth didn't copy. It repurposed. They tried to land reinforcements. Drop pods, sleek and self-guiding, fell through the clouds like knives. But their entry paths had already been compromised. Satellites long since considered obsolete were suddenly reactivated, flooding the upper atmosphere with noise, heat signatures, reflective chaff, signal jamming. What descended was no longer precise. Pods scattered. Some crashed into oceans. Others into mountains. A few landed, only to be met by resistance they couldn't have predicted, civilians with nothing to lose and everything to defend. The sovereignty didn't understand how a planet with no central command could still coordinate. They didn't grasp how humans, divided by language, culture, politics, could still fight as if they were one mind. They never realized that unity, in its purest form, doesn't come from obedience. It comes from shared purpose. And Earth had found its purpose. They thought we were fighting for survival. But survival is reactive. We were doing something else entirely. We were learning. Every encounter, every skirmish, every intercepted signal became another lesson. Where the sovereignty relied on perfection, we embraced failure. We failed faster, adapted quicker, and struck harder each time. They couldn't see it happening, because they were looking for strategy. But what they were facing wasn't strategy. It was evolution. A new kind of warfare was being born, not in labs or war rooms, but in basements, scrapyards, shattered cities. Children rewired alien batteries. Farmers welded plating to old tractors. Codebreakers hacked navigation systems from the dark corners of the internet. In the deserts of Australia and the frozen fields of Siberia, Earth was improvising its retaliation. Not in months. In hours. And through it all, the world didn't wait for victory to celebrate. It kept moving. Because on this planet, hope isn't passive. It's an action. Then came the broadcast. It was brief. Garbled. Scrambled through dozens of low-orbit satellites and untraceable networks. The message wasn't attached to any government, any name, any flag. It didn't need one. This is Earth. We are not your vassals. We are not primitives. And we are not done. The sovereignty intercepted it. They analyzed it. They debated whether it was bluff or propaganda. It wasn't either. It was a promise. They thought escalation would end it. They believed the arrival of their dreadnought would silence the noise. It was not just a ship, it was a statement. A monolithic fortress the size of a city, crawling with weapon arrays, shield layers, and a singular gravity core at its heart. It moved like a god through space, slow and deliberate, casting shadows over continents as it neared. No warnings this time. No demands. Just inevitability. The sovereignty had decided that diplomacy was no longer required. Earth would be shown why resistance was not only futile, it was obsolete. But inevitability was a foreign concept here. While their dreadnought advanced, Earth didn't panic. It calculated. Not like computers, but like people who've seen war up close. People who've lost. People who've learned. The dreadnought's presence wasn't a surprise, it was expected. And so, everything humanity had been building in the dark moved into position. Not fleets. Not matching force with force. But pieces. Unseen. Unpredictable. Quiet things. The first act wasn't an attack. It was distortion. As the dreadnought entered orbit, its long-range scanners began to return inconsistent data. Readings fluctuated. Visuals ghosted. Targets appeared then vanished. Thousands of satellites, many of them civilian, decades old, some defunct, were suddenly active, flooding space with reflections, interference, and echo signals. The dreadnought's AI tried to compensate, recalibrate, refocus. It couldn't. It had never been built to interpret deception. It had been built for control. And then came the real weapon. Not a missile. Not a beam. Just mass. Raw, brutal mass moving at impossible speed. From the shadows of the moon's dark side, a single object emerged. It was simple, no propulsion system, no guidance fins, no payload. Just a solid rod of depleted uranium, 20 centimeters wide, fired from a weapon humanity hadn't spoken of publicly in 20 years. It had no name. No glory. Just purpose. The station that fired it had once been part of a failed Mars mission. Stripped down, reassembled in secret, and retooled with one function: launch a kinetic slug at escape velocity and trust gravity to do the rest. It had only one shot. One chance. It didn't miss. The rods struck the dreadnought just as it began charging its main cannon. Not through the shields. Those were still active. But the slug didn't need to penetrate directly. It hit the edge of the ship's mass field at a speed the sovereignty hadn't imagined possible from a pre-FTL species. It triggered a collapse in the artificial gravity well. The dreadnought didn't explode. It folded. Its hull twisted, imploded inward, then tore itself apart in a wave of magnetic distortion and silent fire. The largest ship ever to enter Earth's atmosphere was erased in under 12 seconds. No announcement. No celebration. Just absence. And the silence that followed was not Earth's. It was theirs. From every corner of the globe, sensors picked up the same thing: sovereign vessels going dark. Systems powering down. Engines disengaging. Some ships simply vanished from radar, fleeing into deep orbit without a trace. Others hovered for hours, motionless, as if waiting for orders that would never come. There was no counterstrike. No retaliation. They had brought everything they believed would ensure victory, and Earth had broken it using a weapon older than their alliance itself: gravity and conviction. What they failed to understand was that power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it hides in wreckage, in rusted metal, in forgotten programs and abandoned space stations. Sometimes it moves with purpose, without praise. And sometimes it strikes not to conquer, but to prove a point. Because Earth didn't want their territory. It didn't want their ships. It didn't even want revenge. It wanted something simpler. To be left alone. To be underestimated one final time. The message hadn't changed. It didn't need to. Because when the dreadnought fell, the galaxy witnessed something the sovereignty couldn't compute: resolve without recognition. Earth didn't fight to win. It fought to make it clear that if you bring the fire, we won't just survive it. We'll return it. They didn't send a message when they left. No surrender. No apology. No admission of defeat. Just an empty sky where their fleet had hovered. One by one, their ships turned, their engines lit, and they vanished into the black without a word. Silence returned, but it was a different silence now. Not one of threat, but of absence. The kind of quiet that comes only after something larger than words has been decided. Earth did not celebrate. There were no parades. No declarations of victory. The fires still burned in cities. The craters still smoked. The dead were still being counted. But everyone knew something had changed, not just above the planet, but within it. The world had faced the abyss. And it had not flinched. The sovereignty thought humanity would shatter under pressure. Instead, it hardened. Their invasion, intended to break Earth's will, had forged something far more dangerous: a unified purpose, tempered by pain and sharpened by understanding. Every wrecked ship became a resource. Every piece of alien code a blueprint. What had fallen was not discarded. It was studied. Absorbed. Transformed. Reverse engineering turned into innovation. Fear turned into design. Ruins became laboratories. Earth didn't rebuild as it was. It built forward. Smarter. Harsher. Not cleaner, not prettier. But more prepared. Fleets formed, not of polished chrome and glowing lights, but of matte steel and unforgiving edges. They weren't meant to impress. They were meant to last. Powered by salvage drives and patched-together fusion cores, they groaned into orbit with the sound of purpose. Weapon systems were crewed by sovereign standards: coil guns, magnetic slugs, heat-based countermeasures, but they didn't need to be elegant. They only needed to work. And they did. The planet once considered primitive had entered the stars, not as a guest, not as a student, but as a warning. Earth's ships spread across the void, not to conquer, but to speak. To the enslaved worlds still under sovereignty rule, signals were sent. Simple messages, translated into hundreds of languages. They came for us. We are still here. The message spread like fire through dry leaves. Unseen voices answered. Civilizations that had been quiet for centuries whispered back. The unthinkable had happened. The sovereignty had failed. And the myth of their invincibility had shattered. The war was not over. It may never be over. But something far greater had been achieved. A line had been drawn in the dark. One world had said enough. And no matter what happened next, that would never be erased. In orbit, new stations hummed with activity. Engineers slept beside reactors. Pilots trained inside machines held together with hope and borrowed metal. No one waited for the next invasion. Everyone prepared for it. Because now they knew the truth: it would come. Whether it took years or decades, the sovereignty would return. Pride would demand it. Control would require it. But next time, they would not face a planet. They would face a force. Earth did not seek revenge. Revenge was petty. Earth sought equilibrium. And if equilibrium required the destruction of the old order, then so be it. Because this species, born in the dirt, forged in fire, and baptized in chaos, had never needed to be the most advanced. It only needed to endure. And it had. The galaxy would remember what happened. Not because it was loud, or fast, or clean, but because it was honest. A civilization stood on the brink and did not fall. The sovereignty, for all its might, had never understood what happens when you back something truly dangerous into a corner. Now they did. Earth had fired back. And the stars would never feel safe again.